Dear Professor Krauss, thank you for the opportunity to having you for this interview, and welcome to Germany, of course, in the wonderful city of Heidelberg.
It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be in this beautiful city. It's a nice opportunity.
So maybe we start with some cautious things. When did you start your career as a scientist?
When? Well, it's hard to know when I started I guess I officially started my career when I got my PhD, which was in 1982. I like to think that I was a scientist while I was a graduate student, and I wanted to be a scientist from the time I was young. So my interest in science began much earlier. But I've been doing science officially as a professional, if you wish, a credentialed professional, since 1982, which is now 37 years. It's hard to believe I'm that old.
So physics are also your favorite stuff in school?
No, actually, the point is that I still do. I like everything. I find the world is a fascinating place, and I like to not restrict myself. When I was a student, I was interested in many things. In fact, when I graduated high school, I won the prize for history because I was working on a history book, a social history of communism in Canada and the Depression. But the understanding the fundamental way the universe worked always was my overriding sort of interest. I was always interested in it. I found it fascinating. I still do, trying to be the first person to understand how the world worked. From the time I think there were two aspects that got me interested. One, my mother wanted me to be a doctor, and she told me doctors were scientists, so I got interested in science. That's partly it. And she was very concerned later when I didn't become a doctor. But also when I was 11 or 12, I read a book about Galileo, and that had a huge impact on me. And then there are many other events afterwards, but I just think there's nothing more fascinating than trying to understand how the world works.
So being a scientist is one thing, but you're not only a scientist, you're also a science communicator and storyteller. I think this is also very important for public understanding of science. So when did you start becoming?
Well, again, it wasn't a plan. It's not as if I planned my life out in advance. Many things that have happened to me have been accidents, and I followed those accidents. But I was always interested in communicating. Partly because what got me interested in science was scientists who communicated. What got me interested in science was reading books by Isaac Asimov and George Gamow and then Richard Feynman, and watching the tremendous series The Ascent of Man by Jacob Bronowski. And so I admired those people, and in some sense, therefore, I wanted to be like them. I thought if I could be a scientist who also, I was inspired by them. And watching them lecture, watching Feynman lecture, undoubtedly influenced me. So that was something, I guess, I was always interested in. But I was always interested, I'm very political, and I was always interested in the real world. And part of the problem of my decision to do physics, as I wrestled with what I would do, was my concern that it was far removed from people. And somehow writing about the relationship of science to people helped me connect the two. And I've always written, and from the time I was a grad student, I wrote. It didn't get published. But I think that combination of political interest and interest in people is what helped me decide to do that. And then really what firmed that up for me was early on. I worked at a science museum when I was a young person. And that was a tremendous experience, not just because it gave me the opportunity to hone my skills, which it really did, but also it gave me the opportunity to understand what interests people and what doesn't interest people. And that was tremendously influential in my life, I think. So it was a combination of things. And then what happened was and I tell young people this, they say, how can I emulate you in some way, and for better or worse? And I didn't have a plan. I think young scientists should spend their time doing science, primarily. Not necessarily communicate. They could take advantage of every opportunity if they're interested in communicating. And not all scientists need to be communicators. As I often say, there's some of my colleagues who I want to keep away from the public. But I think that if they're interested in that, they should take advantage of those opportunities. But the better science they do, the greater will be the opportunities in the future. So I tell young scientists, focus, if you're talented, focus on the science and then take advantage of opportunities. And in my case, I just took advantage of opportunities. I wrote. Most of the things got rejected. Then some things happened, and then as I became more well-known, I had more opportunities. And it was just a series of not accidents, but I was always interested. And the debate about evolution, the teaching of evolution in the United States, is really, I think, what propelled me, a combination of that propelling me in the public mind, and a combination of the books I wrote about science just because I'm excited by science, which raised my profile, that allowed me to have the opportunity to speak out. And I take that seriously. As you pointed out, it's important. I try to balance the two. I've always tried to continue to be an active scientist because I love the science. And I guess the way I've often said it is that if I'm talking about science but not doing science, I've kind of felt like a fraud. And if I'm doing science and not talking about it, I felt irresponsible. So it's the combination of the two.
It's very time-consuming to doing both things.
It is time-consuming, and you have to sacrifice a little bit. But as you point out, look, I do what I want to do. Ultimately, that's what governs me. But I also think I will not know, and it's not up to me to know, which is, of the things I've done in my life, which are more important: the scientific discoveries I've been involved in, or my impact on the public. I try not to judge that. I do what I think is important at the time, and I try to be my own guide. And sometimes I'm working intensely on science, and sometimes on other things. It's always a balance, but life is a compromise. But I know that I wouldn't be satisfied doing just one at this point, for most of my career. And like most people, I think you do what you want to do. You rationalize it, but I do science because I enjoy it. I enjoy interacting with the public. I enjoy writing. So ultimately, while I hope it has a positive impact in the world, I do it because I want to do it.
Of course, we are enjoying you doing both things. One of the important projects in the science communication is the Origins project. You're founder of the Origins project. Can you describe the aims of the project?
Well, yeah, that project is now ended, and it's gone for 10 years, and it was one of the most exciting projects I've ever been involved in. The aim was to basically explore foundational questions in a transdisciplinary way. Namely, fundamental questions may not require the disciplines of the 19th century to address. And we looked at questions ranging from the origin of the universe to the origins of the future, to the origins of violence. Important questions. That's why I coined the term origins for that project, because it's so all-encompassing. If you look at the forefronts of every field of study, they always come back to origins in one way or another. And so what we tried to do was bring together scientific meetings, bringing the best minds in the world together who may not talk to each other, to maybe see what questions are accessible to research. But at the same time, if these questions are important, they should be relevant to the public. And we wanted to produce public events that related to them. So whenever we had a meeting, we'd have a public event. And I'm very happy to see that the Origins project, the public events that we've had have been, I was convinced, and I wanted to convince the people in my town that people are interested in science. And we have 3,000 people attending. We had 3,000 people attending our public events in science because they're gripping and interesting, and they bring together people that people want to hear. And I'm so happy that by the incredible international attention and appreciation for what we did there. And then the final aspect was an educational aspect. We created an educational portal that was based on our meetings, where teachers and students could access material. And while it lasted, it was very good. And I hope maybe at the future to carry it on in a different way. But it's been a wonderful experience, and I appreciate the response that people have had around the world. And it's convinced me that, every 10 or 15 years I've taken on a new challenge, and I'm going to try and take on new challenges in a different way. But the legacy of Origins I want to keep in whatever I do next.
So science education has to start very early, to the better.
Well, I mean,
how important is this to have science education for children?
It's incredibly important. What we do, children are born scientists. We tend to turn them off through our educational system. Kids want to explore. It's fun. They want to discover how things work because it's neat. It's solving puzzles. It's fun. And what we do too often is take that innate enjoyment and turn it off, make it seem like it's rote memorization, and it's not. And I've often said that we need to teach science, of course, early stage, but what's important are not the facts so much. Because in your phone sitting there, you have access to more facts than you ever had in school, but you have also access to misfacts and false news. And what science teaches us is how to tell the difference between the two. So what we need to do is teach the process of science, how to separate the sense from the nonsense, how to question skeptically, how to question yourself, the kind of questions you have to ask. So I've often said we should be teaching science by encouraging kids to question. And the material itself isn't as important as the process, in my opinion. And also the fact that to teach kids by saying I don't know. I've often said to parents and to teachers that saying I don't know is really important, because you can say I don't know. It may be something you personally don't know, but other people do. You say I don't know. Let's try and find out. Let's make it a voyage of joint discovery. Or it could be something we could say no one knows, and that's the beauty of science, is being comfortable with not knowing, because it means there's more to learn.
Yes, this is true. The German Richard Dawkins Foundation works on the Evo Kids project. It's by Giordano Bruno Stiftung. And this is teaching the theory of evolution in primary school at a very early age. And critics say it's also a kind of indoctrination like religious myth or intelligent design apologists. What do you reply on this?
Well, as long as teachers aren't saying you must believe this, it's true, but I'm not going to explain why, then it would be. Both Richard and I have said, and I firmly believe, that often teaching religion to children is child abuse, because when children are too young to really intellectualize it, they take it in an emotional way, and it's very hard to get rid of later on. If we're teaching evolution, we have to teach in a way that's appropriate. Get kids asking questions. What's the evidence in the world? Looking around and seeing that they should not believe stories without evidence. So if it's taught right, it's not the same as religion. But the last thing I would want teachers to say is, this is the way things are, you must believe it, as they do in church, because that would be wrong. But I know from knowing Richard and knowing the work that he's interested in, that's not the way you want to teach it. You want to teach kids to think and question. In fact, Richard and I were once together at an event, I think at the Sydney Opera House. It was somewhere, and people said, how can you convince people to follow you? And we said, we're not interested in getting people to follow us. We're interested in getting people to think. And that's really what we want to encourage kids to do, is think. And it's fine to teach the theory of evolution. It's fine to teach something else. But what you want to do is get kids to think critically. That's the more important thing to me than the actual subject matter.
Yes, you are not a religious, you don't need a kind of religious fellowship. People don't have to follow you. I don't want people I want people to be happy to disagree with me, and I want to be happy to disagree with others, and that's called communication. And I think it's really important, especially in this world where people are often afraid of communicating for fear of offending, that people should be open and willing to communicate back and forth, and that's productive. And that's a learning process for everyone. So another topic is to say, when the United States catch a cold, Europe sneezes. So how does the war on science, you call this sometime, of the Trump administration and alternative facts affect the scientific community and work in the USA? Well, and maybe in the rest of the world. In every single way. One of the reasons why I write about science, about politics, one of the people say, why do you talk about politics? And my point is that science imbues all political decisions. All the important decisions we're going to make in the 21st century, from energy to the environment to healthcare to national security, every major decision that all governments, certainly the governments of the United States, deal with, require scientific input.
namely evidence. They should be evidence-based. And when they're not, we should all be concerned. And you're absolutely right. There are many bad things that are going on in the United States, and there aren't happening elsewhere, but the United States tends to export everything, good and bad. And let me say, the United States exports a lot that's good, but I see in other countries, when they say, oh, this isn't a problem here, I see creeping the problems elsewhere happening. And so we need to hold governments accountable to reality. Because the only way democracy works is if you have an informed electorate and informed legislators. And that is why we need to all speak out. Not for science because science is somehow godly, but because it works. And that's why we can't ignore the United States. I was very pleased early on, and since it's the Richard Dawkins Foundation, to say that at one point, the Oxford University strongly considered me to replace Richard as the chair that he had just retired in, and it was a great honor. But I told them that I thought if one didn't keep one's foot in the United States, you couldn't possibly deal with the public misunderstanding of science. And it was very important to me, especially since I initiated the Origins Project, to keep that foot in the United States. And I couldn't move to England full time, and that was an issue. I think it's really important to not deal with the fact the United States is the elephant in the room is a mistake. And I don't think we can deal with the public misunderstanding of science without dealing with the problems in the United States, not least because in terms of media, movies, TV, the United States is the source for many people around the world of much of their information.
Yeah, you mentioned Richard Dawkins, and you are well known as a scientist and science communicator. You're also well known as an advocate against religious superstition.
Let me make it clear, I'm an advocate against any superstition.
Okay.
Ideology of any sort, on both sides of the political spectrum. Ideology is the enemy of knowledge, in some sense. Assuming something's true, we are the easiest people to fool. And I'm not saying I'm immune to that. We all should be questioning ourselves. Ideology means you believe something in some sense to be true, and you're not willing to be open to the possibility that it might not be. And that's a problem.
May I ask, when you first met Richard and when you started having events together, which also results in a wonderful movie, The Unbelievers?
A great honor in my life to do things with Richard, but go on. We first started because we disagreed. We had a conversation, but we disagreed about the way to approach religion as a scientist. And Richard tells a story, and I don't remember it that well, but basically I think we first met when he was giving after a talk, and I confronted him from the audience afterwards and said, I disagree with your technique and your approach, and I think one should try a different one. And we had a conversation, and then we actually built up that conversation later into a dialogue which we wrote together for Scientific American, the journal Scientific American. It's an American magazine, but I think there's a German version. And that actually became influential because it caused Stanford University to ask us to come together and do a public event in a discussion, and that was the beginning of our public discussions. But early on I thought, the question is, if you're trying to convince someone to open their mind, is the best way to tell them that they're an idiot right away? And often it isn't. And I think Richard and I have a complementary approach to things, although we've converged a lot in our time together. But I think the point is it requires 1,000 points of light. There are many different ways to get people thinking. One way is to seduce them and go to where they are. Another is to confront them sometimes and say, look, this is ridiculous. Can't you realize what you're saying is ridiculous? And I think it takes all approaches, and different approaches work with different people. And I think Richard and I like to think that in the past that we've been complementary in the way we deal with things. Although, because we spent so much time together, I think our views have converged a lot. But we're very different people, and I think it's worth celebrating that.
There's another thing where Richard differs to your approach. He declined to discuss with Christian apologists like William Lane Craig regarding your discussion with the letter, what you hope to accomplish.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to what Richard says. The question is, I'm very sympathetic to what's the purpose of a debate? Debates are I'm never going to convince the person I'm debating with, whether it's a UFO specialist or a fundamentalist apologist. So what you're really doing is talking to the audience. And the question, the thing that I have tried to do when determining if I should engage in a debate is, do I think that I might be reaching people who might not be reached otherwise? Or do I think I may be exposing falsehoods most people haven't thought about these issues in the public. And they're willing to, both people sound eloquent, they're willing to say he said, she said. So he's absolutely right. William Lane Craig wants to be on the podium with Richard or me or other people because it raises him. Because our profile is bigger than his, at least among the general public. And so, why do we want to do that? And I ask that question a lot. If someone wants to debate, the sole purpose, once they're on stage, it somehow makes them credible. That's not a good. Then you don't want to do that debate. But if there's the possibility in a debate that you might reach people who might otherwise not be reached, I think it's worth considering it. Now, I will say the very first time I debated William Lane Craig, I didn't know who he was, and I realized afterwards it was a mistake. I wasn't prepared for. I thought he was probably an honest religious person, and there are many I've talked to who was misguided. I didn't realize that he sort of was a professional debater and who had tricks independent of the truth. And I agreed later on. I did a series of debates later on with him in Australia, and once again, I didn't do that voluntarily. A well-meaning Christian group in Australia asked me if I would come and do some events in front of their congregation, and I was happy to do that. After I agreed to do it, they told me that they were having William Lane Craig come, and I warned them about it, but I agreed to do it, and I agreed to do it there because I felt I needed to confront some falsehoods that he was saying, and it may be a mistake, but I'm quite sympathetic to the fact that debates just for the sake of debating is a waste of time, and you've got to ask what's the good that comes out of it, and can you reach people that you wouldn't otherwise? And I'm now very, very hesitant to debate. I think I've done a lot. And I'm very, very hesitant to go back and debate people, and I think I've done my time, as they say.
There was the same discussion regarding the Kenham-Benai debate.
Well, I refuse to look. Let me point out, I wouldn't have done that debate. I don't want to. I think it was totally inappropriate to do that debate, and I don't want to go into details. But I will say that in a more appropriate context, I did debate Kenham. Namely, when the Creation Museum opened, first of all, that morning, I was in front of the Creation Museum, being the keynote speaker to lead a protest against it. And then I flew to New York to do later in the day to be on a Fox News, which is sort of a right-wing news program, Bill O'Reilly program, where they had me and Ken Ham on. It was a neutral setting, and I think it was a much more effective way of. I mean, in that setting, it was very simple. I just let Ken Ham talk, and he did all the work for me. But I would not have gone. I don't think it's appropriate to go to the Creation Museum and give them the credibility of debating on there. But anyway, that's a personal decision. I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, I think also. So, almost 10 years ago, an article showed that atheists are the most mistrusted group in the USA. Does it change today?
Well, what is true, the United States is a very religious country, but what is true is that even in spite of that, in the United States, in England, in most of the developed world, the number of people who are defining themselves as religious is decreasing. That's a fact, and it's true even in the United States. The number of people who are declaring themselves either atheists or not associated with a specific religion, whenever they're surveyed, that number is increasing. It's now maybe close to 25%, and it's probably much greater, but many people are afraid to say because they feel that if they say they're not religious, people think they're a bad person. So that percentage of people, especially young people, is increasing. But I definitely still think that in the United States, the pressure, the United States religion, especially at the current time, where the federal government has been hijacked by religious people. Donald Trump, for whatever reasons, has let religious evangelicals come in and play a role in his administration that no other president has been involved in. None, not even George Bush. And I think he feels that, I'm convinced he does things only for self-gain. And he doesn't believe it for a second, or he doesn't care whether it's right or wrong. Nothing he says does he care whether it's right or wrong. What he cares about is whether it'll allow him power and influence and more television time. So he's using the evangelicals, but I think he thinks that they're his religious base, his electoral base, and he's allowed them incredible influence, which I think is incredibly dangerous as well. And so, given that they have much more influence, there is the danger in the United States that because they have more influence in Congress, that people who come out as atheists are more suspect. I've evolved my thinking. I don't have any ist. I don't like to define myself, except maybe being a scientist. That's the only ist that I'm happy. And I'm not always a scientist. I like to try and behave like a scientist, but in my life, I have moments of superstition. I'm sure everyone does. But if I was going to define myself as an ist now, I wouldn't be an atheist. It wouldn't even be an anti-theist, which I used to define myself as, because my late friend Christopher Hitchens coined that term, and I really liked it. But the term I use now is an apatheist. Namely, I don't think God is relevant to anything. I don't care about God. It's not as if I hate God, because it's like saying I hate the tooth fairy. It's irrelevant to everything that I do and think about in my life, because I'm interested in the real world. So I'm an apatheist.
Yes, maybe we come to talk about your latest book, the German edition.
Oh, thank you.
Das größte Abenteuer der Menschheit. Von Versuch, das Universum zu entschlüsseln. The original title is the greatest story ever told so far, why we are here. So, is this book thematically a successor to your book, Universe from Nothing?
Yeah, absolutely. I intended it to be a successor. The Universe from Nothing did two things. First, it described the amazing revolutions in our understanding of the universe on larger scales. And secondly, it showed how science actually addresses a question that's been usurped by religion. Why is there something rather than nothing? And it actually can address that question. It may not have all the answers to that question, but we can have a plausible understanding which doesn't require any supernatural gobbledygook. But in the context, I was able to show people how our picture of the universe has changed on the larger scales in ways we never would have imagined, even when I was a graduate student. So that was that. The new book does the same thing. But now on a different scale. It talks about the revolutions in our changes in our understanding of the universe, not on the largest scales, but on the smallest scales, particle physics. The incredible revolutions that took place in the 20th century that are unheralded. What happened in the latter half of the 20th century rivals even the development of quantum mechanics and special relativity in my mind, but most of the public don't know it. But at the same time, it also addresses a question that I think has also been usurped by religion, which is, why are we here? Now, when I say why in both cases, I point out why questions really have no meaning. When we say why, we really mean how, as scientists. But the question, why are we here, really means how are we here? And our understanding of the fundamental structure of the universe, which reveals an incredible hidden reality underneath the surface, shows that the universe on fundamental scales is not at all like we imagined. Just like my book, A Universe from Nothing, showed how the universe on the largest scales is not at all what we imagined, which is great. It means we get to overcome our innate myopia. But the realization that the universe is different on fundamental scales excuse me, demonstrates profoundly that the universe isn't designed for us. That on fundamental scales, we couldn't even exist if you look at the fundamental laws of physics as we now understand them. It was only due to an accident in the early history of the universe, when some field called the Higgs-Feld froze in a certain way, that allowed us to be here. And so our existence, as I say in the book, is no more fundamental then why ice crystals on a window, some of them point in one direction and some of them point in another, and our existence is like one ice crystal pointing in one direction, but it could have easily been an ice crystal pointing in another direction, in which case we wouldn't be here. So our existence has no fundamental relationship to the universe. It's quite clear that we are not a cosmic even afterthought, but a cosmic accident. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to realize, because it means it demotes us in one sense, but it raises us up in another. It's the incredible conceit of religion to assume that the universe is designed so we would be here. How much more conceit can you be? Often religious people say scientists aren't humble. But it's the ultimate in humbleness to point out that maybe we're not the center of existence, and be willing to accept that fact. And so while it's humbling, it also raises us, because if we're here by an accident, we should take advantage of that incredible accident, the fact that we've evolved conscious brains, and we can appreciate this wonderful universe and even make our own lives better because of that appreciation, and make the most of our brief moment in the sun without assuming some divine entity is pulling the strings and going to make it better for us or worse for us. We are responsible for our own future.
I think religious people think they are special, they are something special. But
look, I've learned I don't want to categorize all religious people. I think it's demeaning to people to categorize all people. I think different people are drawn to religion for different reasons. Everyone wants to be special. I want to be special. We all want to be special, and hopefully we all are special to someone else, and maybe even to ourselves. But it's different to say that than to say that there's some cosmic specialness. Well, there may be a cosmic special if we're the only conscious life in the universe due to the accidents of the evolution of the Earth. Then it's remarkable, and it would be such a shame if we led this planet to lead to the demise of life on this planet. If this remarkable cosmic accident happened only once, I think it's unlikely, but it might be. But so I think, yeah, religious people probably, like everyone else, want to feel special. I think another reason is the universe is cold and unforgiving, and people want to feel that there's something taking care of them, because it's awful to think that the universe doesn't care whether you exist or not. It's scary to some people. Again, for me, I think we need to try and encourage people to think that maybe it isn't so scary, maybe it isn't so bad, maybe it means that we make our own specialness, that the universe doesn't make it for us.
Of course. When I first read your book titled "The Greatest Story Ever Told," it reminds me on a movie with the same title.
Well, I obviously took that as a, yeah.
And in your book, you're using biblical chapters and quotes. So how you came up with this idea?
Well, look, the point is that a lot of people got mad at me for using biblical quotations, but there are a lot of good biblical quotations that relate to what I want to talk about. And the point is, the Bible, at least in the United States, for many people, because of that movie, was called the greatest story ever told. But the Bible is not a very good story. The greatest story ever told is the story of the real universe, which is so much more interesting than the story of the Bible. But the most important part of the title of the book is not that, it's the so far. Because the Bible doesn't change. But the greatest story ever told so far changes. The story tomorrow will be better than it is today. And that's why I wanted to play off the Bible, because so many people think that this story written by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun is somehow profound. It's not profound. What's profound is the real universe that we've discovered by using the techniques of science, and that universe and that story changes every day, and that's what makes it exciting. Because the young people growing up now can change it tomorrow. It's not fixed in time. And so, of course, I wanted to play off that notion, because I happen to think, and other people could disagree with me, but I try to argue cogently in that book why the story of our understanding the fundamental structure of matter is the greatest story ever told so far. It's filled with drama and danger and excitement and mistakes, all the things that make stories good. Human foibles, it's all there. And that's what makes a story interesting. And people should realize that science is a human story. It's a story of how scientists led to where they want. And it's important to realize that you should differentiate between science and scientists. Scientists are pig-headed and ideological often, and we all are. We all have ideas in our head, and it's hard to get rid of them. The process of science is what we use to help us overcome the innate lack of scientific approaches in all of us. We all want to believe. And what the scientific process allows us to do is overcome that innate lack of skepticism. And so it's important to distinguish between scientists and science, and I try and do that in the book as well.
Yeah, much more interesting story, and because we don't know the end, maybe we will never know.
Maybe we'll never know. Well, it's no problem. I mean, some people think that, well, unless we know everything, we know nothing. And Richard Feynman said it. I mean, look, a lot of the good things have already been said. So when I say something, people quote me, but probably often I've learned it from someone else. But Richard Feynman said, it's okay not knowing. He didn't want to know everything. Maybe the universe is like an infinite onion. And every layer, every time he discovers something new, there's another layer, and maybe we'll go on forever. All he wanted to do was know a little bit more than he did before. And that's my feeling. I don't need to know everything, but I'd like to uncover something new about the universe and learn something I didn't know the day before, and that's why I do science.
Yes, of course. When you take a look the last 100 years, what are the biggest change in the scientific view of the world, of the universe?
Well, I think the biggest change is that the world we take for granted, atoms and elementary particles and everything that forms the structure of the universe around us, is really an illusion. At a fundamental scale, all the elementary particles are probably massless, and none of the structures we see, from atoms to boulders to humans to planets to supernovae, would exist if some accident didn't happen. So at a fundamental scale, what we realize now is the universe looks incredibly different than it does on our scales. And that's a continual process that science has evolved in. But I think the story I tell is one of the more profound examples of that.
How important is the concept of symmetry in physics, and how important is the broken symmetry?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a complex. Symmetry is what I try to show there is concepts of symmetry, which began, by the way, with a woman mathematician, which is near here in Emmy Noether, who tried to get a position in Groningen, in Göttingen, and was never allowed to have a paid position there because she was a woman. Times have changed quite happily. But the concept of symmetry is the overriding concept that governs the way particle physicists, at least, think about the world. We think about symmetry in a way that's very different than the common term. It's like evolution. People say the word theory. The way people use the word theory in common parlance is very different than the way scientists use the word theory. Well, the way we talk about symmetry is very different, and therefore it's not an easy concept. Artists use it and other people use it, but it's not a concept that is simple, and that's why I walk readers through it. And the concept of broken symmetry is even stronger. But the notion is quite simple. No one, at least on the macroscopic laws of physics, the universe doesn't distinguish left and right. No one. It turns out that there are fundamental. One of the forces of nature does distinguish between left and right. But on the scales we see, no one thinks that the laws of physics are dramatically different on the right-hand side of a room than the left-hand side of a room. That's a symmetry of nature, that left and right, that, at least the laws of electromagnetism and gravity don't distinguish left from right. But we all realize that this room that we're in is different on this side of the room than that side of the room. I can tell which side of the room I'm on because that painting is different than the painting on the other side of the room. That's a broken symmetry. The fundamental laws don't distinguish left and right, but the circumstances we find ourselves in do distinguish left and right. I can distinguish left from right because my wedding ring is on my left hand. Okay, that's one of the ways I remember what left is. Okay, and the example I use is an example, once again, not from me, but from a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Abdus Salam, the first Muslim Nobel laureate, by the way, in science anyway. If you've all had this experience of sitting at a dinner table, maybe you haven't, but I have, a circular dinner table, and all the places are set, and if you sit down, and if you're like me, maybe you didn't learn etiquette when you were younger, you can never remember whether your wine glass is on the left or the right, because it looks symmetric. Well, there may be rules of etiquette that determine which you should open or which you should hold, but if I take it on the right first, then suddenly everyone else has to take it on the right. I've broken the symmetry. Before I touched that wine glass, things were symmetric. The minute I touch it, the symmetry is broken. And that's kind of something we realize, that in fact there are fundamental symmetries underlying the laws of physics that are not manifest in the world we live in, that govern the fundamental equations that govern the physics of the universe, but are not manifest in the actual equations that describe how the universe we work with today actually behaves, because symmetries are broken. That subtle concept, which is incredibly subtle and difficult, is important to understand, because if you don't understand it, you can't really picture how the universe really works.
Now, a special question for you. What is your view on string theory and the Higgs field, Higgs mechanism?
Well, string theory is, as many people, as I said before, I'm not sure should be called a theory. We confuse people when we call it. I understand what people mean about it. It's a well-defined mathematical entity, and some people like to call that a theory. But it's not a theory in the sense of a theory of gravity or quantum mechanics or anything else, because at this point, it's not clear that it's related to the real world. There are many physicists who think it is, it might be, but there's no evidence. Now, does that mean people shouldn't work on it? Absolutely not. We all, we all have to realize that most of the things we work on, if we're theoretical physicists, are wrong. If everything we came up with was right, anyone could be a physicist. And so string theory, I think, is probably... who knows if it has anything to do with the universe? The point is, so far, it hasn't demonstrated anything to do with the universe. The mathematics that it's developed has been quite useful for physicists in different areas to apply. It's revealed incredibly interesting and important mathematical relationships. So as an intellectual endeavor, it hasn't been useless. But in terms of explaining why the world is the way it is, it has, in my mind, not had any fundamental successes. Some of my string theory colleagues would disagree with me, but I think making predictions that explain, that agree with experiments that are yet to be done is the hallmark of profoundly important science. And I don't think string theory, I know string theory, isn't like any of the incredible discoveries I talk about in that last book. They have helped us explain how the universe works. String theory hasn't yet done that. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. If you're a betting man or woman, I would say bet against it. Because bet against any theory that hasn't yet been tested, because most theories are wrong. Maybe you'll be wrong, but the likelihood of anything we come up with, as a physicist, I've come up with lots of beautiful theories, but nature hasn't happened to agree with them in most cases. Okay, so when I quote unquote disparage string theory, I'm not really. I'm just saying I'm disparaging the hype, but not the work. Okay, when it comes to the Higgs field is the center. I originally thought the Higgs field, the idea of the Higgs mechanism, was too slippery to be true. It was too simple, I thought. The notion that there's this invisible field everywhere that governs the way the world works just seemed to me to be too slippery, and I was shocked to see that it appears to be the case, that the Higgs field was discovered, the Higgs particle was discovered in the Large Hadron Collider. I was hoping it wouldn't be, but I was happy to be wrong. And it is remarkable, and I talk about it, I herald that in the book, because it is remarkable that this invisible field exists everywhere. But the difference between that and religion says there's an invisible thing that governs the way we work, but then it stops there. If science stopped there, that would be religion. But science doesn't stop there. It says, if there's this invisible field that's everywhere, how can we test to see if it exists? And the answer is build the Large Hadron Collider. In the United States, we were building another machine before that, but Congress, in their immense stupidity, canceled that project 30 years ago almost, 25 years ago. But we said, if this incredible, ambitious claims require ambitious evidence, right? as Carl Sagan and others have said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence in some sense. And this is an extraordinary claim. And if it was really true, we had to build the most complex machine humans have ever built. And I talk about it in the new book, and I herald it because it's an amazing, just that alone is an amazing human achievement. I compare it to the Gothic cathedrals. They're like the Gothic cathedrals of the 21st century. But we said, look, this claim is so profound and extraordinary. If it's true, we better check it. And they did, and I was wrong. That's okay.
I think about the string theory, maybe many people know the string theory because it's a subject in the television show, The Big Bang Theory. And I think the Star Wars fans are happy about the Higgs-Feld because they call it a force.
Oh, well, look, I don't want to... Look, as you know, I wrote one of my books is The Physics of Star Trek, and so I certainly don't mind science fiction, but I don't have the illusion that fiction and reality are the same thing. They may. What I think is important is, I think it's true for Big Bang Theory. Good stories inspire people to think about the world, and science fiction can inspire people to think about science. And Stephen Hawking wrote in the foreword of my book, The Physics of Star Trek, science fiction helps inspire people. So does science, and I think it's really, really profound. And so. But the word but it's science fiction. The operative word there is fiction. It doesn't have to be right. Now, Big Bang Theory. I know the scientist they have who's a consultant, and they often quote things that are true. But what makes it worth watching isn't the science; it's the characters and the jokes. Many of my colleagues don't like Big Bang Theory. I originally didn't, but I came to like it because I think it's very intelligent. And in fact, the writers of Big Bang Theory had me come to the set, and my books are on the shelf of their apartment. So I get a kick out of the program.
You talk about the Large Hadron Collider, which is in Switzerland, and you call them the new cathedrals, like the cathedrals, Catholic cathedrals, the Cathedral of Science. Why it was not built in the USA? You mentioned it because this was skipped 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, what happened in the United States, they were building something called the Superconducting Super Collider, which was actually much bigger than the Large Hadron Collider, and would have had a much better chance of not only discovering the Higgs field if it was there, but actually answering many of the questions that have not yet been answered. And due to politics, it was first of all the biggest tunnel that was ever dug in human history, 60 miles around, had been dug for this. Okay, but Congress decided, for reasons, in my opinion, that had nothing to do with the project. It's true that there were cost overruns because whenever you're pushing the forefront of technology, there are cost overruns. There always are, because you don't know when you're pushing the edge of anything. You don't know what the answer is. But it was originally going to cost $2 billion. It was costing $6 billion at the time, and they thought that was too much. As I've said, that was like the Xerox costs of during the Gulf War, during which something I think was a waste, an awful thing for human history during. But Congress decided, they claimed that they were closing the project because of not good management or because it cost too much, when in fact there were other political reasons to do it. It seems to me, when you look at $6 billion to answer the fundamental questions about why we're here, that's the cost, less than the cost of one aircraft carrier. And look, the bottom line is you have to judge it. But if we are so impoverished as a country in the United States that we can't afford that much money, more money by the government is spent on so many other things, then we have to worry. But so they cancel. But what really upset me is I can say, okay, look, it's hard economic times. We can't afford to do it right now, but we'll do it later. But that's not what Congress said. We're going to kill the project. We're going to fill in the tunnel if we can, or get rid of it so it can never be done again. And that was just stupidity. They spent $1.5 billion or $2 billion on that project out of the $6 billion, and they made sure that money was completely wasted, instead of saying, let's save it for later on. So I think it was an example that politicians aren't governed by common sense, but by what is politically expedient at the time. And it's unfortunate. Now, the Large Hadron Collider got built. We at least discovered the Higgs. We haven't answered the other questions yet. So these things will get done. But for the United States, as far as the United States' preeminent position in that field, it did great damage. From a world perspective, maybe it's not such a bad thing, but as I try to point out to politicians, and it's true in every country, one of the reasons to invest money in truly foundational questions, not applied questions, but curiosity-driven questions at the forefront of science, is not necessarily because they're going to produce practical machines, but because you encourage the best and brightest students to come study in your country. Some of them will later on go and found Google or something else that makes a difference, but it's important to if your country has the disposable income, to invest in those foundational questions, because the most exciting questions will attract the best minds, and then they'll go on and do their own work later on.
Well, that's leads to my final question. Your book title, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. What lies ahead of us?
Well, you know, people often ask me questions like that, and I like to say I don't make predictions about the future, except for 2 trillion years in the future. When first, it's easier to say what will happen, and second, no one will be around to question me anyway. I like to think that the whole point of science is not knowing what's going to come next. Now, I do know that every time we open a new window on the universe, we're surprised. So we've got great things coming on forward. We've got the successor to the Hubble Space Telescope. We now have gravitational wave detectors. I may talk about them tonight here in Heidelberg. And so we may be building quantum computers. I know the areas where we're investing in new technology, and therefore where new discoveries are likely to be made. But what I like to say about science is every day I'm surprised if I'm not surprised. And I hope that today I'll be surprised.
Professor Krauss, thank you very much, and enjoy your stay in Germany.
Thank you, and thanks. It's been a pleasure talking to you.